Hello and welcome to lesson number 2 in module 2, part 2. This lesson is going to be called the fear trap. So at the age of 19, Albert Ellis was terrified of rejection by women. Of course, at that point in his life, Ellis had no idea that he would one day become one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. It didn't even figure into his wildest dreams. What he did dream about was getting over his fear. So what did Albert do about it? Well, for 1 month, he visited the New York Botanical Gardens every day and forced himself to talk to every attractive woman he encountered. Fearful though he was, somehow he managed to open his mouth and get the words out, and by the end of the month, he had asked over 100 women for a date. And get this, not one single one of them said yes. Ouch, right? But Ellis didn't see this as a failure. On the contrary, he regarded it as a great success. Why? Well, because at this point he had completely overcome his fear of rejection. He had learned that fear was nothing more nor less than an unpleasant feeling, that it couldn't stop him from doing what he wanted. It was a profound insight that freed him to live a lifetime of adventure. Now, as an aside, I realize this may make Ellis sound a bit like a pickup artist, and I'm not advocating or condoning this behavior. I merely want to use it as a dramatic example of someone overcoming a deeply held fear. Imagine you've grown up in a weird community and you've been taught that sheep are the most dangerous animals on the planet, that they have huge razor-sharp teeth that can tear you to shreds, that they love nothing more than to kill and eat humans, and that they can leap higher than a 3-story house. Okay, so suppose you completely believe this, and then one day you're all walking through the countryside when you suddenly catch sight of a sheep. It's staring at you from behind a small wooden fence. How would you feel? Nervous? Anxious? Terrified? Now, this may seem like a far-fetched fantasy, but it's rather like the way we've all been raised to think about fear. From a young age, we've been educated to believe that fear is bad, that it's a sign of weakness, that it's unnatural, that unsuccessful people don't have it, that it holds us back in life, and that we need to reduce it or get rid of it. And we all too readily believe this stuff because, number one, the brainwashing starts when we're naive little kids, and number two, fear feels so unpleasant, it seems to make sense that it would be bad for us. So as a result, we have learned to fear our own fear. We have become anxious about our own anxiety. We have gotten nervous about our nervousness. See the vicious cycle? Well, have you ever heard the saying, get back on the horse? Now, personally, I've never fallen from a horse, but I've been told that it's pretty scary. Immediately after a big fall, most people would have some fear of getting back on, especially if they were injured when they fell. But the sooner you get back on and start riding again, the sooner you will regain your confidence. What happens if you don't remount the horse, if you put it off week after week saying, I'll start again next week? The longer you put off riding, the greater your fear becomes, the greater your fear grows. So if you want to get back into horse riding, then you have to face your fear. You have to get back on the horse, so to speak. And psychologists refer to this concept as exposure. Exposure basically means staying in contact with whatever you're afraid of until you get used to it. And it has more positive impact on behavior than any other tool, technique, or strategy known to humankind. You've probably seen documentaries where people overcome their phobias. Let's say the subject is terrified of spiders. He panics whenever he sees one and he won't go anywhere near them. He lives his life doing whatever he can to avoid spiders. He avoids looking at pictures of them. He closes his eyes if they appear in movies. He even tries to avoid talking about them. The problem is, the more he avoids anything to do with spiders, the more afraid of them he becomes. So to get him over his fear, a psychologist exposes him to spiders in a gentle, step-by-step program. So first he looks at pictures of spiders, then he watches videos of spiders, then he looks at realistic toy spiders, then he looks at dead spiders in display cases, then he looks at living spiders crawling around inside glass jars. Eventually he can even hold a living spider in his hand. As you can see, this approach is the very opposite of avoidance. Now suppose what we fear is not something outside us, like a horse or a spider. Suppose what we fear is an emotion, feeling, or sensation. And of course, for us, we're specifically talking about social anxiety, but it really can be any emotion or sensation. As long as we go through life trying to avoid that feeling, we will never overcome our fear of it. As we've talked previously, avoidance is like an emotional amplifier. It takes our fears and makes them bigger and bigger, and this then leads us to try even harder to avoid it, which makes it even bigger and bigger. So, the more we try to avoid, the more we become stuck in the fear trap. We become stuck in the fear trap. So what's the alternative? Should we just grit our teeth, put up with the fear, and force ourselves to go through with it? Well, we could do that, but I don't recommend it. There is another way of responding to fear that is radically different from almost everything our society encourages us to do. And that, of course, is expansion. Expansion, which we've covered expansion already, but I want to take it one step further. I want to help you to be able to use fear to actually turn it to your advantage. It's actually a bit like riding a wild stallion. Fear is like a wild stallion. If we know how to harness its energy, we can use it to our advantage. But if we don't know how to handle it, we're in trouble. Imagine approaching a wild stallion without some good horse wrangling skills. You get kicked, bitten, or trampled, and waste a lot of time and energy with no useful outcome. On the other hand, if you're a skilled horse whisperer, then you can approach that horse safely, and over time, if you treat it well, you can build a good relationship with it and eventually ride it. Now, I have to admit I know absolutely nothing about handling horses, but I do know quite a lot about handling fear. So I'm going to show you how you can become a fear whisperer. No joke. There's a simple ABC formula for fear whispering. When fear shows up, we allow it, befriend it, channel it. Allow it, befriend it, channel it. And let's walk through each of these individually. So the first one, allow it. Think of that wild stallion racing around. If you ever want to make use of its awesome strength, speed, and stamina, you first have to allow it to stay on your ranch. And the same goes for fear. There is a huge amount of energy within our fear. Remember, the fight or flight response evolved over hundreds of millions of years to prepare our bodies for action. Fear gives us sharpened reflexes, increased muscle tone, heightened awareness, and greater strength. It's like a potent fuel. But we'll never learn how to use that fuel if we're not willing to handle it. Remember, in a previous lesson, you learned how to allow your fear and anxiety. You notice it, acknowledge it, make space for it. After allowing, the next step is to befriend it. If you want to tame that wild horse, allowing it to stay on your ranch is not enough. You have to build a positive relationship with it. You have to win its trust. Well, how do you do that? Well, from what I've seen in the movies, you approach it cautiously, talking softly and gently, getting closer and closer, and then you offer it some tasty food, and if it lets you, you stroke its flank, keep talking calmly and soothingly, and show it that you're a friend, not a threat. Now, at this point, your mind may start protesting, but I don't like this feeling. Rest assured, you don't have to like it. For example, let's suppose there is a lonely old man in your neighborhood, okay, and I offer to pay you $10 billion to befriend him. And let's suppose this man has some unusual habits. He's prone to angry outbursts. He wears kind of dirty clothing and neglects his personal hygiene. So you don't really like him, and yet there's $10 billion at stake here. Would you make the effort to befriend this lonely old man, even if you didn't like him? For $10 billion, I sure would. So how about fear? If befriending it helps you to live by your values, achieve your goals, perform at your peak, develop genuine confidence, and generally live a richer, fuller, more meaningful life, then are you willing to make the effort even though you don't like it? Befriending your fear is just like befriending a person. Friendliness involves being pleasant, welcoming, affectionate, trusting, collaborative, and helpful. Does this sound like a tall order? Well, maybe it is, but I encourage you to give it a try and see what happens. See from what your own experience is. Be pleasant and welcoming to your fear. It may seem really weird, but try talking to it, while keeping a sense of humor about it. You might say, "Hello, fear. How thoughtful of you to drop by today. Come on in and make yourself at home. What do you want to do today? Oh, you want to give my heart a bit of a workout, do you? Well, please, do be my guest. See how fast you can get it racing. Oh, you want to chase some butterflies around my stomach? Please go for it. My house is your house." Obviously, you wouldn't do something like this in the middle of a job interview or while having a discussion with someone, but there are plenty of times and places where you could try this, such as in the car, in bed, waiting in line, during commercial breaks on TV, and so on. Be affectionate toward your fear. If you've got a good imagination, you can imagine shaking fear's hand, inviting it into your body, and slipping your arm warmly around its back. And if you're somewhere private, then you could gently place a hand on the fear, that is, on the part of your body where you feel the fear most intensely, and hold it gently, letting it feel the soothing warmth of your hand. Be trusting toward your fear. It's not out to get you. Fear evolved for a purpose, to help us handle challenging situations effectively. It alerts us to risks and threats, and readies us for action. So, it's a necessary thing. We'd be in big trouble if we didn't have any fear. Be collaborative with your fear. Recognize that you're playing on the same team here. Don't fight with your fear. It's there to support you. It's a signal. It lets you know you're facing a challenge. So perhaps you could remind yourself, this is my brain alerting me to a challenge. This is my body getting me ready for action. Regard it as a teammate, not an opponent. Be helpful toward your fear. Fear evolved to give you strength, speed, focus, and stamina. So help it do its job. Help it to put its energy into something useful, something meaningful, something life-enhancing. In other words, channel it. Cast your mind back once more to that wild stallion. You've allowed it to stay and befriended it. Now what? Well, now you want to use it to your benefit. You want to saddle it up and ride it. And so it is with fear. You've allowed it, befriended it, now use it. Take a moment to notice how much energy it gives you, all that adrenaline flowing through your system. Did you know many athletes, business people, and stage performers don't use the word fear to describe those feelings they have when facing a challenge? They'll often talk, instead of being revved or pumped or juiced, wired, or amped. These terms all acknowledge the energizing aspects of the fight or flight response. So ask yourself, how can I make use of all this energy? What activities can I channel fear into? For example, if you're playing sports, being physically active, or giving some sort of performance, then you can channel all this fear energy into it. Reminding yourself to use your fear can make a huge difference a lot of the time. And here comes the next rule of the social confidence game. Genuine confidence is not the absence of fear. Genuine confidence is not the absence of fear. It is a transformed relationship with fear. Remember I mentioned I became afraid every time I had to give a talk or presentation? Well, before I start my talk, I make room for my fear. Take a deep breath and say to myself, okay, here we go. Let's put this energy into action. The fear is still there, but my relationship with it has transformed. Now it's not something I need to make room for in order to get on with my life. It's something useful in its own right. It's a potent fuel, a burst of energy that revs me up, gets me buzzing, and enhances my performance. And you can do the same thing in your life. Remind yourself regularly to channel your fear and notice the difference it makes when you do so. It may take a while to get the hang of this, but when you do, it makes a huge difference. Over time, you may find yourself using words like pumped and amped instead of fear and anxiety. And if there's nothing for you to channel your fear into, then make room for it and engage fully in whatever you are doing. Alright, so let's end this lesson with one more rule for winning the social confidence game. And that is, don't fight your fear. Allow it, befriend it, and channel it. Okay, so that summarizes the main concept or idea that I want you to take home from this particular lesson. Don't fight your fear, allow it, befriend it, and channel it. So in the last lesson of this module, we're going to go through a summary of all the acceptance techniques. There'll be a few new ones that you can add to your arsenal as well. So I encourage you to practice those. I'll see you at the next lesson.